Namaste, and welcome to this week's discussion on the Bhagavad Gita. This evening, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss Chapter 2 and stanzas 60 through 63. And this is a very interesting part of the Bhagavad Gita. As you remember from our last session together, Krishna was speaking about the senses and how the senses draw us out and draw us outside of ourselves and make us forget that our true purpose is to be one with God within ourselves. And so he goes on in this discussion after explaining the agency of the senses. He then goes on into chapter 2 here in stanza 60, and he says, O son of Kunti, Arjuna, even the wise man, devoted to self-control, may sometimes be swept away by the turbulent senses. And so I'd like to speak about this one this evening. It's a very fascinating one, and I think something, as we get into it, you'll see that every one of us can relate to this. I'll mention that I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and if any questions arise during this evening's discussion, please send them in, and I'll try at the end to give some attention to them and answer them as best as we can. I'd like to, before beginning a bit of a discussion on this, I'd like to read the first paragraph of what Swami Kriyananda writes in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. He says, and this is something we all want to pay attention to, he says, no devotee should underestimate the formidable power of subconscious tendencies. Their tentacles are farther reaching than anything the conscious mind can perceive or even imagine. Now again, no devotee should underestimate the formidable power of subconscious tendencies. And this is a wise counsel, because isn't it true so oftentimes we are making very good progress, our meditations are going well, our life is perhaps going well, and we begin to feel a certain satisfaction, and perhaps we begin to feel very confident in our own inner abilities to be able to maintain ourselves on the spiritual path. And perhaps as that happens, our guard goes down, and all of a sudden we let ourselves open and become vulnerable to be swept away in this direction or that. Swami Kriyananda would often say, quoting Paramahansa Yogananda, he says, no one is safe until they've reached that state of nirvikalpa samadhi, which means being able to transcend the ego. You find in life oftentimes things are going just really great, going tremendous for you, and all of a sudden a thought comes, a certain set of circumstances come into our life, and they're just perfectly satisfying to some long-held desire maybe that we've had, and all of a sudden we're attracted to them where we didn't think we had that attraction at all, and we can be swept away in one direction or another. One of Swami Kriyananda's favorite stories that he would tell many times, and it's because he did tell them so often, I'm sure he enjoyed it, and it was favorites of one of his favorites. And he would tell the story of how Narada and Vishnu were out walking one day. And as they were walking, it was a hot day, they were walking, and Narada asked Vishnu, he says, Vishnu, how is it that people are subject to Maya? They're carried away in delusion. How is that possible? Why would they not keep their mind and their attention continually upon you? And Narada says, that's a good question, or Vishnu says, it's a good question, Narada, but before I answer, it's such a hot day today, and I see yonder there's a village over there. Would you please go to the village and bring me back a glass of water? And so Narada says, certainly, my lord. And he goes off to the village, and he, in the intent to get a glass of water, and he goes into one of the first houses he sees. He goes there and he knocks on the door. And opening the door, there's a beautiful girl opens the door and invites him in and says, "Oh, kind sir, how can I help you?" And Narada is very taken by the beauty of this young lady and goes in and says, well, I've come for water. And she serves him, and says, oh, please, sir, you must be very tired. It's a hot day today. Please, take a seat. I will serve you. And he takes a seat, and she brings him water, brings him probably some sweets. And the parents are there. They come in, and they meet Narada, and they says, oh, you must stay for a meal. Here we cannot possibly let you go without serving you. And so they very naturally, graciously serve him. And Narada, he drinks the water, he eats the meal, he meets the family, and all the time his eyes are very keen on attention to the young lady that greeted him at the door, and he finds himself becoming infatuated with her. Well, as time passes and it rolls by, he's there quite a long time, and he forgets it completely about why he came in the first place. And the villagers, the family says, well, you're here so late, why do you stay the night? And he stays the night, and the next day they treat him again very nicely, and he's feeling very comfortable. And finally they say, well, you're a young man like you, a man like you, why don't you stay in the village? And they offer their daughter to him in marriage. And so Narada is very taken with this, and he says, yes, that seems like a very good idea. And so Narada settles down in the village, becomes married, takes over the household, some fields are given to him to cultivate. And so he makes a good life there, and his wife has one children, and then another, and then a third. And life is going very well, and time passes by until finally one day there's a great flood. The rain comes, and the village on the banks of the river finds itself threatened as the river begins to rise, and it rises and begins to sweep everything away. And pretty soon they're in danger, and everything is being swept away into the river. And Narada, in order to escape with his family, grabs his family, puts one child on his shoulder, grabs another child by the hand, and his wife in the other hand, who also has the young baby with them, and they begin to make their way through the rushing water. It's getting higher and higher, threatening to sweep everything away. And finally he stumbles, and the child on his shoulder falls into the water. And in order to save the child, he lets go of the other child and grabs for the little one, but he misses. And that child, the one who he let go of his hand, they're both swept away. And the mother, seeing the two children going away, loses heart entirely and just allows herself and the third child to also be swept away. And there Narada is in the river, seeing his whole family, his land, everything, his home, everything that he had has gone into destruction, and he just gives it up. He gives up his life and just sinks into the water and allows himself to go with the water. And a little time passes. Narada's laying there, and he hears a voice in the sand. He's washed to the shore. A little bit of time passes, and he hears a voice. It says, Narada, Narada. And he opens his eyes, and there's Vishnu standing there over him. And Vishnu says, Narada, what happened? 1/2 hour ago, I sent you off to that village to get me a glass of water, and here I find you sleeping in the sand. And so it is that life can sweep us away, who knows what. And the message here is what Krishna is saying, is don't be tempted, don't tempt fate, don't gamble with fate. Like Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata, he gambles with Shakuni. And when you gamble with Shakuni, you cannot win. There's, in many countries and some cities, they have these casinos where you can go into the casino and there's the slot machine. You put the coin in the machine and pull the handle, and perhaps you win. And you see people become very excited with their winning at the slot machine. But you know, I mean, everybody must know this, of course, that you cannot win. If you play long enough, sooner or later the odds are stacked against you, and ultimately you will lose at the slot machine. It's inevitable. That it cannot be otherwise. And so it is with life, to the degree we gamble with delusion, we gamble with Maya, we gamble with the senses and saying, they won't touch me, I'm beyond that. Well, as long as we have this embodied in this ego, this sense of I, this sense of identification with the body. As long as we think that I am the doer, eventually we're subject to the rules of Maya and that delusive influence. I like to think of the image of a table, a dining room table perhaps, or one of those billiard tables, and it seems very, very flat. Well, life is not like that. It's not totally flat. You could say the table of life is very slightly tilted. It's tilted, and if you put the round ball on that table, and there's no friction there, the ball will slowly roll down to one side of the table. And you could say life is like that. This world of creation is tilted very slightly toward Maya, toward delusion. And all things being equal, slowly the direction will go there. And it has to be that way, because if it was not that way, if there was not a propensity for life force to go out, this universe wouldn't exist. This universe exists because there is an outward flow from to manifest this creation. It's an outward, ultimately, of course, it's a divine flow. It's an outward flow into creation itself, and we are swept by that flow as the natural state of being. This is why it's said in all scriptures, east, west, everywhere, the spiritual path is always described as an ascent. In other words, it's something that we're always having to struggle for. It's, or the image of climbing a mountain, of overcoming obstacles, whatever it might be. It's always stated in that way, that there has to be an expenditure of energy, there has to be an act of will, there has to be a conscious choice made in order to ascend this mountain of spirituality. And this is how it is. We don't naturally roll, you might say, downhill into divine awareness. We have to struggle. Life is a struggle. We have to overcome those tendencies that pull, that is pulling us down into delusion. And this is that pull is often expressed through the senses. Now, we have to, in the spiritual life, this is why we have to make a conscious choice to be able to find God. We have to choose to practice our sadhana. We have to want to have that divine awakening within us. And this ability to choose implies a certain conscious act of will. Now, the best choice, you could say, for all of us is, yes, of course, is to choose God, but in the practice of acquiring wisdom, the most practical thing we can do is to choose our environment wisely. Choose those influences in our life that will help us to be able to overcome whatever it is that stands in our way. You can see that if you arrange your life in such a way that very naturally you're going to be influenced in this direction or in that direction, you'll see that it's not so difficult. Paramahansa Yogananda used to say that environment is stronger than willpower. And it's so very true. Because all of us in life, we find ourselves, we're going up and down, up and down. We have good days, we have bad days. But if we put ourselves in a positive environment, we'll say even in the bad days, there's a subtle influence that's going to push us in a certain direction. And this is why if we say, well, I can put myself in any environment, it doesn't bother me. It's like the reformed alcoholic who thinks, well, I'm reformed, I don't have any temptation for drink, and so he surrounds himself with good quality wine and spirits, and he says, it doesn't bother me. But our life is up and down, and when you go into that down phase, he becomes tempted, and he ends up reverting back to the bad old ways that he thought he had overcome. And so be wise. Look at your environment. Look, what is it that's, if you want to make progress on the spiritual path, if you want to meditate, if you want to take on certain qualities, associate with people that are like that. Swamiji always used to say, he says, if you want to be an artist, associate with other people who are artists. Or if you want to be a mathematician, associate with mathematicians. If you want to be a yogi, associate with yogis. And this is true for whatever outward or whatever types of character and qualities that we want to take on. We begin to take them on through our direct association for them, with them. Now, Swamiji also mentioned something about this. He says, where even the wise man, as the Gita says, can be swept away. And as we look at ourselves, he said, he made it a point. He says, become aware. He says, be self-aware enough to the first feelings that begin to be attracting you into this direction or that direction that might take you off the path. You can feel those in the heart. If you begin to practice meditation, if you begin to if you're a Kriya Yogi, you'll begin to be sensitive to the pulls in the heart, and you can feel. And when that first attraction comes, there's a little bit of excitation. When you're a little bit excited about something, a desire comes or an opportunity comes, and there's this excitement, and you can feel that pull. If you can catch it at that time, that's the best time, because then it hasn't built up momentum, and it doesn't have the strength that it will have later on once it's embedded itself in your consciousness. So try to catch it then, and you'll find that you can easily dispel that. But again, coming back to the basic message here is don't gamble with delusion. It has a great power, and don't allow yourself to be fooled by thinking that you're stronger than delusion itself, because it just isn't so. The next stanza that takes us to chapter 2, number 61, and it continues here again. And this whole section of the second chapter, toward the end of the second chapter, concerns this topic. And Krishna goes on and he says, he who, having subjugated his senses, has become united with me, remains engrossed in the infinite self, knowing it as the supremely relishable. Only mastery of the senses can bestow the steadfastness of true wisdom. And again, Swamiji comments here at the beginning of his commentary I'd like to read. There are two requirements above all for the attainment of wisdom. One, to withdraw the mind not only from sense objects, but from the senses themselves, and two, to remain merged in the consciousness of God as the most desirable of all goals. So here Krishna, what he's saying in here, and Swami comments on it, he says to be able to remove ourselves, there's two things that are necessary for us to be able to overcome this pull, you might say, of out into delusion or into Maya. One is to withdraw from the senses, and two, the second part is to put ourselves with attention on God, or something higher, you might say, than our own individual selves. We have to have, the message that is important to realize in this is that we have to have both sides of this. We cannot simply remove ourselves from the senses alone. And this is sometimes, people forget this when they're meditating particularly. You could say, if we put this in the context of meditation, what are we trying to do when we're meditating? We're trying to become very, very still. And in the process of becoming very, very still, still of body, still of mind, still of the emotion, becoming very, very still, we begin to withdraw the life force from the senses. The life force itself begins to retreat away from the senses back into the inner spine, into the deep spine, the Shoshona. And as this begins to take place, the senses are turned off. But if we leave it simply at that, we're not going to be successful, because sooner or later those senses, something will activate and something will pull us out again and again. We have to do two things. We have to withdraw from the senses, but at the same time, we have to positively be putting our attention in a positive direction at the same time we're withdrawing. So it's withdrawing from the outer world in stillness, and that stillness means stillness of the body, stillness of the mind, stillness of the emotions, of the heart. And if you take this even deeper for the yogi, it's stillness of the breath, and it's even stillness of the all bodily functions. That we become very, very still, and that life force then withdraws. But at the same time, as we're doing that, we need to positively direct that life force towards something transcendent. And in this case, we did toward the higher self, toward God, toward bliss, toward one of those aspects of the divine. We have to have the two sides, because if to do the second, to direct ourselves positively and the life force upwardly toward the point between the eyebrows or toward the divine, to just have that and without withdrawing from the senses will eventually fail, because we'll be pulled out again and again. And on the other hand, to just withdraw from the senses and have no direction to where is this life force being directed toward, it will withdraw. We have to also have a destination for that life force, and that's the upward aspiration of the life force up into the divine, or up into the light. And so when you meditate, think of these two parts of meditation. And I like to use the word stillness. I've been using this lately because it encompasses much of what we try to do in meditation. Many people, if you're unable to keep the body still, you'll find that you'll never have the ability to go deep into your meditation. So look, when you meditate, sit and tense and relax the body, relax it as best as you can, find a comfortable position, and then keep the body absolutely still, without tension, of course. And the best way to do that, of course, is to relax it and to try to forget the body. But you'll find that if you can stay very, very still, time will come when you'll begin to forget it. It'll begin to dissipate your awareness of it. There's always, you'll find too, is usually when you first try to stay still, the body will resist, it'll rebel, and it'll start to perhaps tempt you to move, a little itching here, or a little fidgeting there. If initially you resist that temptation to move, it gives up its effort and it'll leave you alone. But try to stay very, very still. And then you'll find from bodily stillness, through the practice of our techniques, Hong Sa technique or Kriya or whatever those techniques of learning to harmonize the flow of the life force in the spine, or being able to watch the breath and get the breath to slow down, you'll find that it very naturally will then lead to a stillness of the mind as well. So start there, but then while in the midst of that stillness, put your attention very strongly here at the point between the eyebrows, and concentrate at that point. But concentrate more than just with the mind, with the heart's desire. Yogananda used to say, just call out to God, reveal thyself, reveal thyself. And between the one hand stillness and the second hand and the other hand of directing your energy upward, you'll find that very quickly you begin to transcend this sense of bodily disturbance, and you begin to go into a deeper state of meditation with this. Practice this the next time that you are meditating. You'll see that it is so. Krishna goes on from this point. He says, and this is, I think, one of my, it's a favorite stanza of mine in the Bhagavad Gita, but it's also a very classic one. And when people recite the Gita, this one often comes up because it's so very, very true. You might say it describes what happens here to all of us, in some ways in big ways, but also in little ways. It's the state of us living in this world. This is chapter 2, number 62 and 63. Dwelling mentally on sense objects breeds attachment to them. From attachment arises craving or desire. From craving, when frustrated, springs anger. Anger produces delusion. Delusion causes forgetfulness of the self. Loss of memory as to what one is in truth causes decay of the power of discrimination. From loss of discrimination ensues the annihilation of all right understanding. And it's so classic. It's from dwelling mentally on sense objects breeds attachment. Attachment breeds craving. Craving breeds anger. Because of course we want things to be a certain way and they aren't that way. Or perhaps that craving is unsatisfied and then immediately anger arises. And you'll see there's two major components, you might say elder brother, little brother components in our life. Desire, craving in this case, and it says desire and anger, they go together on our life. And whenever you see in your own life, whenever you see you become a little bit angry, something irritates you, something frustrates you, something doesn't work in your favor and you become angry, look, what was it? Why are you angry? And you'll almost always find that it's because something didn't go your way. You wanted life in some fashion to be other than it is. And in consequence, you become frustrated with that and you lash out. And the two always go together. So the inability to be able to recognize and accept life as it is and to be content, one of the niyamas, to be content with as things are. Not that you don't necessarily want to change them or to make things different, but to be able to recognize life as it is in order that you might then be effective to perhaps make that change or do something different. This is the mark of a wise person, to be able to do that. Swami Kriyananda used to say, and he was quoting Paramahansa Yogananda when he would say these, he would say, whatever comes of itself, let it come. In other words, there's no necessity to be able to resist or to continually, as most people live in life, is to continually wish things to be other than they actually are. This is what you see so much in life. Oh, if only this would happen, if that would happen. And the discontent of always wishing for life to be other than it is takes one's attention away from what really is. And it's only if we can recognize what really is that we're able to effectively do something about it. Now, Swamiji goes on in this commentary to mention that the linchpin of all of these, you might say this descent into delusion and into forgetfulness entirely, the linchpin of all of it is ego. The idea that we are this body and the idea that this attachment that we have. And as long as we have that sense of I-ness, that sense of ego identity, there's always going to be that difficulty and that wishing for something to be other than they are. And this is why in yoga, the whole purpose of yoga is learning to be able to transcend that sense of ego, to be able to not destroy it, not to kill the ego as some people sometimes think, but to transcend it, to get to that state of consciousness that Paramahansa Yogananda expressed when he was in his poem Samadhi. The cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. The cosmic sea, watch the little ego floating in me. In other words, we've transferred our sense of identity away from the littleness to the larger sea, and we just then see the ego for what it is. It has its function, but we're no longer identified with it. And so this is the direction that the yogi wants to go. Krishna then continues with number 64. It says, the man of perfect self-control is able to act in this world unaffected by it, inwardly free from attraction and repulsion. He has attained an unshakable inner calmness. And this is the goal of what all of us are being able to, wanting to achieve. To be able to be in this world, but not of this world. To be able to live in this world, as you might say, is the swan that floats in the water, swims in the water, but is untouched by the water. It does not get wet. Completely, the water falls off of it. And this is how the yogi is. It's untouched, to be able to live in the world, but not to be of the world. This is, you might say, the people ask the question oftentimes, how is it possible? I mean, how is it possible to live in this world and not be affected by it? How is it possible to, is it? I mean, maybe we step up a little bit. A person says, is it even possible to live in this world and still be a yogi? People sometimes become discouraged because they have family, they have duties, they have career, they have all sorts of responsibilities that all of us have. And the thought is that, well, if I'm living in the world like that, it's not possible for me to be a yogi. If I want to be a yogi, if I want to be on the spiritual path, I have to go away and somehow escape from this world. I was just a little bit earlier mentioning how the wise one is one who arranges his environment in a positive way. And one can interpret that statement by thinking, oh, if I want to be a meditator, if I want to practice yoga, that means I have to put myself in such an environment, and since I can't do that, my duty impels me to work in the world, my duty impels me to have a family, I have children. Obviously, my environment isn't going to allow me to be able to do that. And you often find this attitude that people think spirituality, the path of yoga, Kriya Yoga, this is something for those other people, those people that can escape from the world and go out into that perfect environment. This is not so. This is absolutely not so. And this is one of the reasons why Lahiri Mahashaya propagated these teachings of Kriya Yoga in the world in his time, and why the great masters have come at this time into the world. Remember the story from the Bhagavad, or not, from the autobiography of a yogi, where Lahiri Mahashaya, he goes and he receives initiation from Babaji, and at the conclusion of that, Lahiri wants to stay, very naturally, he wants to stay with Babaji in the Himalayas, in the mountains, and he begs Babaji to be able to do that. And by this time, of course, he had a family, he had a job, he had a career, but in the bliss that he had experienced in Babaji's presence, all of that seemed as nothing to him compared to the bliss that he was feeling then. But Babaji said no. He sent him back. He was an accountant, remember. He sent him back to Benares to teach. And he says this is, and he sent him back very specifically because this is the age where it was Lahiri's dharma to be one who would demonstrate that one can live in this world, but yet not be drowned in the delusion of this world. And so Lahiri went back to Benares, and he lived many years after that, many decades after that, in Benares, teaching very modestly and living the life of a householder. And it was from that experience that he said, now this is not reserved, this Kriya Yoga and these teachings are not reserved just for those sadhus who have totally renounced the world in an outward fashion. Years ago there was a Swami Kriyananda went to visit a man who was hosting him for some function, and the man wanted to show him his home. And he went to the home of this gentleman, and the gentleman was showing him the house and all the things that one would do in such a situation. And he showed him his meditation room, and the man said to Swami, he says, and this is my meditation room, and this is where my life really begins each day. And after he comes home from work, he says, this is where I go, and my life really begins here. And Swamiji said something that surprised him. He said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. It's too bad. Words to that effect. And the man was startled because he was thinking, no, Swami, that was a very pious thing for him to say, and he was sure that Swami would agree with him. But Swami said, no. He says, what you're saying is that you have wasted your whole day. In other words, by not giving your full attention to that and not seeing God in your daily activity, instead you've wasted the day. And what you should do is you should try to see God in everything that you do. Don't delay in that way. So this is, you could say, this is the goal of those of us who practice, is we meditate, we practice Kriya, we do our sadhana in order that we might be able then to go out into the world and be able to express these teachings outwardly. And so this is the purpose of why we meditate, to be able to be in the world, but not of the world. And finally, I'll end with this one, number 65. It says, with the attainment of soul bliss, every vestige of sorrow disappears. Bliss gives perfect discrimination and soon establishes one's consciousness firmly in the self. Those with unsettled consciousness have no discrimination. Those who are unmeditative cannot know peace. And those who lack peace, how is happiness possible? As a boat moving on water may be swept off its course by a gale, so discrimination may be swept from its path by the vagaries of sensory influence. And here again, Krishna sums up, and I think this is something all of us as yogis want to keep in mind. And for those who lack peace, how is happiness possible? There's one paragraph here in Swami's commentary. It says, mistakes on the path are always possible. The devotee should acknowledge them, at least to himself, sincerely and openly, and then simply forsake them without making the further mistake of becoming upset with himself. I remember Swamiji once saying something about how is it, we was asked a question, and the person asked him, he says, Swamiji, how is it possible to be successful on the spiritual path in the long run? other words, we all start out on the spiritual path with great enthusiasm and great vigor, and we all have high ideals, and we're going to want to be successful, and we start off with a great burst of energy. But as time goes by, and perhaps the years pass, we find that one thing or another comes up to begin to pull us off in one direction in another. And Swamiji mentioned a couple things about this. He says, most people come onto the spiritual path because they have some good karma. We have good karma to be able to be attracted onto the spiritual path. And as Paramahansa Yogananda said to one of the disciples, it takes very, 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 very good karma to even want to know God. And so yes, you have to have that karma accrued in past lifetimes, I suppose, to be able to come onto the path. But Swamiji made an interesting point. He said, for most people though, their karma runs out. And when the karma runs out, they're pulled away by one delusion or another. And so we've been talking about how the senses, don't gamble with the senses, don't be arrogant or think that you're above it all, and be humble in the face of delusion, because it has its own power, and respect that power. Don't accede to it, but certainly you have to respect if you have a foe, and that foe is strong. Realize that. And so when one's good karma runs out, these obstacles come up and temptations come, and all of a sudden the idea to go in this direction or another direction comes into one's life, and they're gone oftentimes. And Swami said such is the case for most people, unless they're in this lifetime also accruing new good karma. So in other words, you cannot just rest on your past laurels on the spiritual path because life is going well, it seems easy for you, you seem to be making progress, but unless you're putting in conscious effort and attention into your spiritual path, you'll find that these things can pull you away. So we have to always be adding, you might say, to our spiritual bank account to be able to make that withdrawal when the time comes and the time is needed. So this is one thing that he said, we need that good karma will sustain us if we keep adding to it. But then he made another point. He said the other thing is to be able to be successful on the spiritual path, there are three qualities that are particularly important. He says one is the practice of, we come onto the spiritual path, we follow the Guru's teachings. One is, of course, is to follow those teachings and to establish in our life as devotees, have a good solid sadhana practice. He says if you don't, you'll find that as time goes by, you're not going to be able to sustain in the long run. So what he was saying is good habits. Establish the good habits, particularly early in your spiritual life, and they'll carry you on further. And then the second thing he said in this conversation of the three things, good sadhana. Second one is, he said, the spiritual path must be for you a matter of life and death, spiritual life and death. In other words, don't be casual. You have to want to know God. It has to be important to you. In other words, when he said life and death, in other words, this is an important thing for me. It's not just one more thing that I do in this life. I also, I play golf, and I have hobbies of doing this or whatever it might be. This is central to you. It's a matter of spiritual life and death. And when you see life in that way, that I must do this, I need it, then you find you summon up the life force, you summon up the energy, you summon up the will, you summon up the devotion, the desire for God that actually will bring results to you. But don't be casual about it. And now, I can tell you that, but each person in their own way, in their own life, has to make that a reality for them in their spiritual life. I would recommend that you always keep in mind that enthusiasm that brought you onto the spiritual life in the first place. Most people have came onto the spiritual life with a burst of enthusiasm. Don't let that that deep well of inspiration become shallow. Try to feed it, continually feed it, and keep your inspiration high. Those two, one matter of life and death, daily sadhana, and the third one here a little bit applies to what Swamiji wrote here in this commentary. He said the third thing, every devotee to be successful in the long run needs to have the quality of self-honesty, to be able to look at oneself honestly and not be false. Not necessarily, we're speaking not false with other people, but obviously that's true too. You don't want to be false with anybody, but it's most important we're not false with ourselves. We cannot fool ourselves too, and you see this, and perhaps all of us suffer a little bit from this. Oh, I'm really not like that. I really don't have that bad habit, but you know you do, and you know it needs to be changed, and you know you're just carrying it along for one reason or another. You have to be honest to be able to look in the mirror and see yourself as you are, but not to become discouraged. You see, I need to make some improvement, and you allow yourself to do it. Don't beat yourself up. Many people, they feel guilty about perhaps this little imperfection in their life. It's only temporary. It's only a small thing. In the long run, it's most important that you see things as they are. And then, I hope, do something about them. And then, that's the purpose of it. And so you have to have that self-honesty and to be able to not be false or to pretend you're something other than you are. But then don't just accept that whatever falseness might be there or whatever fault, do something about it. And that then you'll find, if you have those qualities, then you find the chances of being successful in the long run are greater. And life, sometimes we live a long time, years go by, it can seem very quickly, they go by, but you'll see as life goes by, we face one challenge after another, after another, after another, and we stumble and we fall, but we always, if we get back up, have the willingness to get back up, eventually we'll succeed. So thank you very much for being with us this evening, and I would like, if there was any questions that came in, I see my technician there shaking her head and saying no, but so for next week, we're going to pick up where we left off, and again, I recommend that you accompany me in the reading of this. The commentaries, I don't want to take up the time to read all the commentaries, but they're marvelous, and you come to a better understanding if you read the commentaries on your own. We stopped on chapter 2, stanza 67, and we will pick up next week in our Bhagavad Gita discussion with stanza 68. Many blessings to you.